Hello and welcome to week 9 of Introduction to Diversity. Today we're going to be talking about Muslim and Arab Americans. Usually when I begin this lecture, I like to ask a couple questions. We started studying hate groups a little bit and we studied the increase of hate groups. And I like to introduce this lecture by asking questions just to get people thinking about stuff. So for example, if I were to say, who's most likely to have a hate crime committed against them? Is it a Muslim American, a Jewish American, a Christian American, a Hindu American? What would your answer be? And now, in these modern times, because of historical events that have happened in the last 20, 30 years, most people's answers are going to be Muslim Americans. However, what you find is the hatred against the race or religious groups still goes to people that are Jewish, which is what we're going to study in about a week or two. So again, when you study hate crimes, it turns out that ones that are religious based, it's 50% against Jewish Americans and only 14% against Muslim Americans. So the only reason this idea of Islamophobia became so present obviously comes out of an incredibly small sect of zealots that are not representative of all of Arab Americans or Muslim Americans, for example. Just this small group has then created a stereotype against Muslim Americans in America. So again, this is kind of where the idea of deconstructing stereotypes come from, and then asking questions like, why are Jewish people receiving so much hate crimes versus Muslim Americans? Because then you can go even further back in history, albeit, since 9/11, you did have this xenophobia, this cultural fear of Islamics, people identify as Muslim. However, if you go back 10,000 years in history, what you're going to find is, of course, Jewish Americans have, historically been oppressed by an incredible amount of groups, from Europeans to Romans to Africans to Persians, And so that's why when you look at the statistics, it overwhelmingly is shockingly Jewish people receive the most hate crimes when it comes to religion, not Muslim Americans. So again, this fear of Muslim Americans that has spewed out in America over the last 20 years really just comes from one event. But again, what most people don't really realize is who was bombing over there first. Why did Osama bin Laden actually come and, bomb the Trade Center towers? And then when you really look at a really hard, look at history, the Americans were there first. We were over there bombing and we killed about 100,000 people. So that's why when Osama bin Laden came back and he killed 10,000 people, still the U.S. has still now, killed 10 times the amount of, Muslim and Arab Americans, or not Americans, Muslims and Arabs, than the United States did. So again, when you look at history and when you look at society, you got to ask a lot of questions because, you're told a lot of stuff, but that's the goal of sociology, is to work through this and kind of analyze the system and look at history and look at actually what happened and then ask some real good questions. Where does this fear of Muslims, where did that come from in America? That didn't even exist when I was a little kid. So where did that come from? We used to hate the Japanese. Well, why don't we hate the Japanese anymore? And when I first started asking that, I was like, they bombed Pearl Harbor. Yet now everyone loves the Japanese. Why? Well, and then so one of my students said, well, because we had the Cold War right after World War II, so everyone stopped hating the Japanese and started hating the Russians. But again, guys, this class is about asking an incredible amount of questions and really examining diversity and examining how groups interrelate. Why are Muslim Americans and other Americans not getting along in modern times? And are they not getting along? Is that actually a myth? Because, according to my standards, people in America in modern times, you can see that I think racism is kind of going down. So again, we have to ask a lot of questions, and the answer to a lot of it, is history. But again, it's Jewish Americans that receive more religious hate crimes than Muslim Americans, okay? So what does it actually mean to be Muslim or Arab or Middle Eastern, okay? Which race are they? So technically, they're white. Anyone from the Middle East, which is a very vague blend of a lot of countries, and no one really knows exactly what the borders of the Middle East are, considering that Russia borders it and China borders it and India borders the Middle East and Africa borders the Middle East and Europe borders the Middle East. So where does the Middle East, really begin and where does it end? And, some of the dividing lines are a country of origin And then other ones are just kind of using our imagination. Like Pakistan was part of India, but why do we consider Pakistan the Middle East? 50, 60 years ago or 1940s, Pakistan was part of India. That was northern India. And then Hindus and Muslims kind of went to war, and there was, a death of about 1 million people as Hindus had to leave where Pakistan is now, and then Muslims had to leave where India is now and go up to Pakistan because Hindus think that Muslims are inferior. And so Muslims didn't want to be ruled by a Hindu majority, for example. And so some violence had broken out, and then about 1 million people died just in the walk as we were creating a new country and then calling it Pakistan. And then now it's part of the Middle East, right? But why? Again, so according to the US, anyone from Europe and the Middle East and North Africa that does not identify as black is white, okay? So again, Arab, Muslim, and Middle Eastern people are white, according to the United States Census. But again, how do we feel about race in this class? We know it's a social construction, and everybody's just a big blend, okay? So again, the Middle East is an ambiguous geographical designation. It covers North Africa and the Middle East and all these other countries. The region is a blend of multiple religions, multiple philosophies of government, multiple philosophies of life, very diverse cultures, very unique histories, but yet we want to put all these together into a pan-ethnicity, okay? So again, the region is a blend of Christians, Arabs, Israelis, and Muslims, all superimposed upon each other, okay? So again, that's that question, are Jewish people white? Well, according to the United States Census, they are. But are they? Are Indian people Asian, Or are they actually just Middle Eastern? A lot of questions, okay? Because people in Pakistan are actually Indian. So are they Asian or are they white and Middle Eastern? Very confusing. Okay, so again, the point is race is confusing. That's the point of this class. You guys need to pick up on that. So Arabs, they're an ethnic group, okay? That's a culture. Muslims are a religious group. What's the association between Arabs and Muslims and Middle Eastern is, yes, they all fall into an ambiguous geographical region. They all have some overlapping blends of ethnicities and religions, etc. But again, not all Arabs are Muslims, and not all Muslims are Arabs. Some Muslims are North Africans. Some Muslims are Indians because they're from Pakistan. Some Muslims are Americans, okay? You cannot identify a Muslim by nation alone, and being Arab doesn't mean Muslim. Being Arab means you identify with an Arab culture, okay? Arab Americans, immigrants from countries that make up the Arab world, such as Africa, Europe, and Asia. Again, it's people that subjectively identify as Arab, have been immigrating to the United States. It definitely started in the 20th century, and then after 9/11, we had some issues, okay? The unifying thing with most cultures are these values, beliefs, your language, your way of life. So again, Arabic language is a unifying force, but a language is just part of your culture, okay? How many Arab Americans are in the United States? 3 million. That's an estimation, okay? And again, Arab Americans, as with Latin Americans, as with Asians, is this idea of pan-ethnicity. Same with white people, okay? White people is all across the globe. It's Russia, to Europe, to the United States, So again, there aren't really any races, but there are these pan-ethnicities, these groupings of cultural things that we have in common. Do white people have something in common? Now you're on to a good question. Do black people have something in common? Is it a common way of life? And is the segregation of that way of life because you live in American society that was historically segregated based upon race and ethnicity, for example? Okay, so you got to ask some questions. Would these ethnic diversity be a lot more blended if we didn't have things like segregation that are blocking people from hanging out with each other, for example? So again, pan-ethnicity is this, again, idea of all South Americans are like some race, right? They're not. It's just a blending of different ethnic groups. Same with Africa and every other place you go, okay? So ethnicity is based upon culture, and then again, the nation of origin, because a lot of times nation of origin, language, beliefs, values tend to fall under an umbrella category of culture, okay? So Arab Americans are very blended. The identity of Arab Americans is very blended. You have all these intersecting variables such as religion and the country of origin and the culture and their history and what do they specifically identify with. Muslim Americans, as with Christians, have taken on a large part of the world's population. Okay, again, 2,000 years ago, you start to see these major religions start to evolve out over time. And then as the smaller religions get consolidated into a few big religions, such as Christian and Hindu and Buddhist and Muslim, okay, then most of the world starts to identify just with a few. Just kind of look at corporate America. It's like that, right? Once the big corporations take hold, all those smaller businesses get weeded out and you no longer have access. All you have is a Starbucks in every corner instead of like a cool coffee shop. And that's how religion is, okay? It's been consolidated into the hands of the few. It's been consolidated into just a few major religions, and now most of the world follows these religions, okay? So just things to think about when it comes to religion, okay? Is religion truth, or is it a social construction? Is religion something that's been socialized? Can you prove it? Can you disprove it? Why do people go to war over something you can't prove or disprove? A lot of good questions here. All right, so Muslims, 24% of the world identifies as Muslim, 33% of the world identifies as Christian. And I bet if we were to look at this in modern times, because religion is again kind of losing hold, I bet you would find a slight reduction in that. However, about 95% of people tend to identify with some kind of religion. So we can't discount that, So Muslims have the same God as Christians and Jewish people. Everyone believes in the same God. So why is there so much history of conflict, such as the Crusades? Why are 2 million people interned in China right now? There's some questions, okay? 'Cause that's a lot. They found like 300 internment camps in China, and I don't understand why the world's not more upset about this right now. That's really like a Holocaust death camp. Okay, things to think about. Faith is divided into sects such as Christianity and Judaism. So religion is a major structure of their life if you're Muslim American, okay? This involves prayer and a common way of life. And again, that's culture. Religion, language, those are parts of culture, a common way of life, okay? So again, it's hard to totally estimate these numbers. So they're based on ranges, but the Muslim Americans by race in America, if you were to look at it like this, which your book does, African American 20 to 42, South Asian 24 to 33, Arab 12 to 32, other 15 to 22. So as you can see, a lot of Muslims that are in America are coming out of North Africa, for example. Immigration for Muslims was a more modern thing, but then again, 9/11 changed things a little bit. And then again, as we've talked about, most people on this planet have been slaves at one time. The Irish were slaves to the Vikings, Muslims were brought to America as slaves. Okay, so again, this idea that African Americans are an exclusive group, they're not. Most people have been enslaved, and there's all kinds of forms of slavery going on. It's just that African American was just so in your face. That's why we're constantly talking about it. But when you always focus on one thing, you might miss out on the fact that Muslims were slaves too. Okay, indentured servants that came here were slaves. Native Americans were essentially slaves in the silver mines. You got to ask some questions, okay? So then the definition of Islamophobia, a range of negative feelings about Muslims, and often Arab people get included in this, even ones that identify as Christian, about their religion, okay? So when they do a study, they found around 40% are favorable toward Islamics and 62% of people are afraid of Islamics. And again, stereotypes have an effect on people, okay? So if we can deconstruct these stereotypes, then maybe we can improve diversity. Maybe we can improve people's self-esteem. Maybe we can improve how people get along and interact in society, okay? So again, I've talked a lot about deconstructing variables such as sex and race and gender and things that keep us apart in this class. So contemporary life, most Muslim Americans, Arab Americans tend to live in urban areas. They tend to live in more low-income areas because this is a common trait of most immigrants, right? Your first generation, you start out from the bottom and then you slowly start to wake your way up, okay? And again, immigrants for that are Muslim and Arab, this is a more recent phenomena. So this is like the first, second, third generation that are really getting their foot in the door. And you know how hard it is to compete against the oligarchs of America, okay? Family plays a central role. The religion does permit multiple wives, along with many other religions. Sexism is universal. That's a harsh thing to say. I shouldn't even, maybe I should question how that's written out. But again, this idea of male domination is very much built into cultures of the world. So again, I talk a lot about women's rights, and again, when we get a little bit deeper, but women's rights, traditional attitudes tend to take away from women's rights. So the more people embrace this idea of males as breadwinners and women as homemakers, women's rights tend to decrease. And then the more people embrace egalitarian ideas like women should be able to vote and participate in politics and drive a car and go to work, women's rights tend to increase, okay? But across the world globally, you're going to find that most people buy into the traditional values, therefore women's rights tend to be very restricted, for example. Okay, so yes, there are some aspects of this. And then you can look at, you know, in America, we use a phrase like genital mutilation, the cutting of the clitoris off of a woman. But again, 98% of women in Egypt have their clitorises and then also parts of their labia removed. Now, you can think what you want about this, but that goes back to cultural relativism versus, you know, this idea of ethnocentric perspective where we are judging from our point of view. So is it wrong to cut a woman's clitoris off? Well, according to Muslims, you're unclean. So again, just some things to think about. It means you're unmarriable in certain parts of North Africa, for example, if this procedure isn't done. And, you know, however, when I teach sociology and we do, you know, Women's Sexual Violence Week, I mean, it breaks me every time because we have to watch the videos on genital mutilation and how women are enslaved into sex trafficking. And you look at different countries like the East versus the West, and then you compare and contrast. And then, you know, again, so there are aspects of culture, but who are we to really judge? If male domination is a way of life, who are we to judge that? Or should we judge that? And again, good questions. Education is very high priority. For Muslims, public schools are more embracing these days of other cultures. And again, the idea of a job, for example, you know, what does that mean? The meaning is also a little bit less understood. But the idea is about covering the female body as dictated by the religion, for example. Again, this is a culture. This is a way of life. Who are we to judge? Or should we judge? You know, again, that's some of the questions you should ask, okay? Because you know, look at American culture. We've always subjugated women. Should we judge Americans for the subjugation of women? Should we judge Americans for enslaving entire groups of people? Should we judge Americans for, you know, killing all the natives? Should we judge Americans for going in and taking out kings of Hawaii and Latin America and sticking our nose in everything? Should we judge Americans for killing 100,000 Arabs, which caused Osama bin Laden to come over and knock out the trade centers? I mean, again, we killed 100,000, he killed 10. Not to say that's good, again, so don't twist my words, because violence only begets more violence. I prefer to use words. But it gets you thinking, okay? So as with Native Americans, Latinos, Chinese, and African Americans, people from the Middle East have experienced discrimination and minority status for an incredible amount of reasons, okay? There's major diversity in the Arab world, so do not assume that all Arabs are the same or identified. That's like saying everyone who's from Mexican and someone from Venezuela like have the same culture and the same way of life. Arguably, they're very different. They do have some similarities like language, but that might be the only overlap. You know what I mean? There are new challenges to this idea of Islamophobia, to breaking down negative stereotypes, because, you know, when did, you know, Islamics really get stereotypes? It wasn't until 9/11. And again, so while we got to ask questions. Why did Osama bin Laden bomb us in the first place? Maybe that'll help us to start to deconstruct some of the stereotypes. And again, Christians went on the crusade. Not all, you know, Christians were crusading. That was like a small sect of people that got together and went down there, like 10,000 people. Okay, so don't assume that like your book talks about jihad and things like that, like all Muslim Americans are out to kill Christians. I mean, it's just these stereotypes are absolutely ridiculous, because are all Christians out to kill Muslim Americans? Look at how many times we've thrubbed our nose in the business. Look at the story of after World War I. Look at what we promised Arabs for fighting the Germans. And then what did Europe do? We went in and took over all their countries, guys. The world systems theory. After World War I, after World War II, all we did was go into their countries and take over. You know, we went and became the upper class, and then we restricted them. And then you gotta ask questions, guys. So study history. Look at what the Europeans and the Americans did after World War I and World War II to Arab America. Look up Prince Faisal, study the kings of Saudi Arabia, and you'll start to understand. Okay, so again, India versus Pakistan. That's Muslim versus Hindus. Hindus think they're superior to Muslims. They will not eat after a Muslim. So again, where did Pakistan come from? Was Islamophobia present in the US before 9/11? How many of you growing up when you were young, before 9/11, can you remember anything like that? You had the Abu character on The Simpsons that was a stereotype of Arabs, just like we have of a lot of people. But what happened to him? Again, because of political rights, and we had changes there. And again, look at the history of the Arab world, okay? One, their history is beautiful. Look at it. While Europe was in the Dark Ages, China and the Arabs were rocking it out, okay? And then look at the history of the Arab world and our relations with the United States and with Europe. And then ask some questions. All right, thank you so much. It's an honor. See you guys soon, and please text, or I'm sorry, please email with any questions. Thank you.